I am 45 years old, and about half of my life I have worked as a night guard at the City Museum of Local Law. The work was for me. No stress, just watch the cameras and go around the premises with a flashlight a couple of times a night. As long as I can remember, I have always shunned people, and I preferred to sleep during the day rather than at night. Maybe someone else would have been scared by the prospect of staying in the big museum all alone all night, but I definitely didn't feel lonely, and books, a radio and a tablet perfectly brightened up my leisure time. In general, I held on to my work with both hands. But a couple of nights last week forced me to run away from this damned institution without even writing a letter of resignation. And it all started with the fact that a new exhibit appeared in the museum, the mummy of an ancient warrior. Archaeologists unearthed it not in Egypt, as one might think, but somewhere in the Altai Mountains, where several thousand years ago it was also customary to embalm the dead before burial. They say that when scientists discovered several such mummies in the mid-1990s and transported them to the Research Institute for study, natural disasters began to occur one after another in Altai. However, archaeologists then convinced all the superstitious that this was nothing more than a coincidence. But the locals were sure that by disturbing the remains of their ancestors, scientists brought a curse not only on the Altai land, but also on everyone involved in this outrage. As the stand in the exhibition hall informed, along with a warrior who died quite young, weapons, various valuables and even the body of a real horse were found in the burial ground. All this, according to the ideas of the ancient inhabitants of Altai, should have been useful to a guy in the other world. The mummy didn't look like the creatures we used to see in horror movies, but to me, it looked even more creepy. Thanks to the permafrost in which the tomb was discovered, the body was well preserved, and even the tattoo on which Griffin's tear prey was clearly visible on it. No bandages, just dried dead flesh, through which bones could be seen in some places, and a skull with empty eye sockets and a creepy smile. The dead man's head also had muscles and even hair preserved in some places, which gave him a particularly disgusting and frightening appearance. This guy was lying on a pedestal in the fetal position, as he was found in the burial ground. To prevent further decomposition, the Altai mummy was covered with a box made of thick glass, under which the desired microclimate was maintained. In general, it was a disgusting sight, but people liked it. Since the mummy was put up in the museum, the people fell in a crowd. Whole families came, brought school classes and groups of students on excursions. Visitors of different ages stared at the mummified remains, made numerous videos and photos, and even shared selfies with the withered corpse. And of course, they soaked jokes of varying degrees of wit. I have never understood where the line lies between a dead body that requires respectful treatment and burial in the ground properly and a museum exhibit that is forever doomed to entertain the public with its unsightly appearance. As if the body was buried not yesterday, but thousands of years ago, all the rules of decency and traditions cease to apply to it. However, my business was small. It was not for a security guard to teach high-minded researchers and museum workers what they could do and what they could not do. A separate room was allocated for the mummy, and the authorities ordered me to keep an especially close eye on it. The dead man was considered a world scientific sensation, and therefore those who wanted to steal this decayed value and sell it on the black market could appear. I didn't like to be in this hall even though I am not a coward, but it was such a pleasure to look at a creepy face in the dark. I examined the hall purely formally, and what could have happened? The windows were controlled by an alarm system, 2 cameras were watching the hall, and the museum is located in the very center of the city. Who would risk robbing it? But as it turned out, the danger lurked not outside, but inside the museum walls. I started noticing the first oddities a couple of days after the opening of the exhibition. Every time I examined the box with the mummy at night, I noticed that it seemed to change its position a little. It was barely noticeable, but still I was sure that the day before she was lying a little differently. At first I thought that the museum staff periodically carry out some manipulations with the mummy, which makes it shift a little. But when I asked one of the museum workers about it, I received an unexpected answer. It is strictly forbidden for all staff to open the glass box. Well, there was another way to explain these oddities. Perhaps the mummy shifts slightly from the vibration created by the subway passing under the museum. Probably many people have heard the story of a spontaneously rotating Egyptian statuette in one of the English museums. Then many explained it with the curse of the pharaohs and the like paranormal. And the blame for everything turned out to be the traffic near the museum and the steps of visitors, which created this very vibration. And yet, I began to look more closely at the hall with our guest from antiquity. From some point on, I began to notice barely noticeable movements on CCTV cameras. Each time I saw them only with my peripheral vision when I looked at another monitor, and therefore I could not understand what exactly happened. At some point, sound visions began to be added to my visual visions. Every night I began to hear a barely noticeable whisper in the museum. The sound was very quiet, it could only be heard in complete silence, and rather it resembled the sound of leaves in the wind. But occasionally in this sound stream I could distinguish clearly pronounced, albeit incomprehensible words. I banished stupid superstitious thoughts from myself, and yet I felt that with the appearance of the mummy in this hall, it became restless. I couldn't share my thoughts with anyone. Any colleague would immediately decide that it was time for an aging night guard to retire. To be honest, I myself began to lean towards this, because I had never imagined anything like this before. I was really thinking of making an appointment to see a doctor, but on my next shift something happened that could not be explained by any problems with memory or psyche. That day, while inspecting the museum premises with a flashlight, I heard a quiet rustle somewhere in the distance. Looking around, I realized that the sound was coming from the mummy hole. It was like the scratching of the claws of a mouse digging a hole. In 2 decades of working in the museum, I have not met a single rodent, and here on you. But as soon as I opened the door of the hole and directed the beam of the flashlight there, the sounds instantly subsided. I carefully examined the room, but I didn't find any traces of mice. But as soon as I closed the door and headed to the other holes, a loud ringing sounded behind me. I ran into the hole again and saw that the glass box with which the mummy was covered was lying on the floor. At the same time, the mummy itself remained in place in the same familiar pose. To say that I was puzzled is to say nothing. All I was hoping for at that moment was that one of my colleagues would run out from behind the curtain and laugh and say that it was a prank. Although who would be so bold and ridiculous to play me, and even with the risk of dismissal? But then how to explain the falling glass? According to the instructions, I had to contact the head of the security service. But after a little reflection, I still decided not to report the incident to anyone and just put the glass back in place. Would anyone believe that the glass itself, for some unknown reason, fell from the pedestal and even flew off a couple of meters? They will decide that I dropped the glass by my own clumsiness and decided to blame everything on otherworldly forces. In short, I spent the rest of the night watching only this one hole through the video recording system. The infrared image on the monitor was absolutely static, but as soon as I looked away, I noticed some movement with my peripheral vision. I turned my head sharply back and there is no movement, and the ugly creature is still lying quietly in its glass sarcophagus. In general, the same whisper, to which I even managed to get used to a little, was especially loud that night, and even my radio could not completely drown it out. Now in this sound I could hear not only words unfamiliar to me, but also emotions. It felt as if the whisperer was asking for help, suffering and cursing his fate. To be honest, I went to the next night shift with genuine fear. I understood that I would suffer a lot from our altai guest, but I could not imagine what was waiting for me that night. Everything was quiet for the first few hours. Then I went out to inspect the premises and again heard a rustle. This time I immediately realized where it was coming from and moved into the hall with the mummy. The rustling died down as soon as I crossed the threshold of the hall. But now I wasn't going to give up so easily and decided to deal with this whole damn thing at all costs. I sat down on the caretaker's chair, pointed the flashlight at the mummy, and began to watch it continuously, without turning my head away for a second. But either this intense surveillance of a stationary object, or the absence of the usual coffee and music affected me, but soon my eyelids began to stick together. It seemed to me that I fell asleep literally for a moment, but when I opened my eyes, I experienced a real shock. The glass box in which the mummy had just been was now empty. Thoughts and questions flashed in my head in panic. Where is the mummy? Who could so quietly walk past me and pick it up? What would they do to me if I don't find it? Having mastered myself, the first thing I decided to do was to view the recording from the surveillance camera. But I didn't find an answer to my questions. The camera recorded me falling asleep, and then for several minutes it gave out only interference. When the image finally returned, I saw only a shadow in the moonlight gliding over the threshold of the hole. The box was already empty by this time. I checked both front doors, they were locked from the inside, as before. The alarm system also worked properly. All this said one thing: the mummy remains somewhere in the museum. Turning on the lights in all the rooms, I went on a hasty search for museum value, deep down not understanding what I'm more afraid of. Not finding it, or, on the contrary, finding it. I walked around the museum hall after hall, trying to find the missing among the amphorae, swords and coins. Suddenly, the light in the whole museum trembled and, surprisingly, my flashlight behaved in the same way. After a few seconds, the flickering was replaced by pitch darkness. And suddenly I heard slow footsteps behind me. Judging by the sound, these were not the steps of bare feet, but they were not in shoes either. They rather resembled a knock on the floor of a tree. Or bare bones. My heart began to beat as if it wanted to jump out of my chest, because I heard this something approaching me. Overcoming my stupor, I slowly turned around and, with my eyes accustomed to the darkness, saw what I was most afraid of. Standing in front of me on 2 legs was the same half-rotted mummy. Empty eye sockets stared lifelessly at me, and hands stretched out in my direction. The creature's mouth opened several times, uttering a whisper in a language I didn't know. Then the thing grabbed me by the throat with both hands. I tried with all my might to escape from her deadly embrace, but the dead man had incredible strength for his withered body. Then I grabbed my only weapon, a club hanging from my belt, and with the last of these, I hit the mummy on the hands. The creature's left hand made a crunch, the grip loosened, and I managed to escape. I ran as fast as I could to the front door of the museum, literally flew out into the street and, without turning around, rushed home. Only after running into my apartment and closing the door with all the locks, I felt safe and took a breath. Of course, I did not return to the museum. And a few days later I heard rumors. The workers found the museum in its usual condition in the morning, only the front door was open and the lights were on in all the rooms. The all-time mummy was lying in its place under the glass, and only a small dent was noticed on her hand, but they attributed it to natural causes. No one could figure out where the night guard had disappeared. I didn't answer calls and messages to anyone. Only one thing bothered me. They quickly found a replacement for me, a very young boy. He could not imagine what trials would be waiting for him at night, and it is not at all a fact that he will be able to get out of them, like me, alive. I felt sorry for the kid, and one night I decided to warn him about the deadly danger threatening him. I had almost entered the museum, but I glanced at one of the windows on the second floor and was stunned with horror. In the dark window I saw that ancient dead man. He seemed to be smiling at me with his sinister grin, slightly tilting his head to the side. The mummy didn't say anything, but it was as if I heard a voice in my head. "Don't bother me." After standing for a while in front of the front door of the museum, I turned around and wandered towards the house. What became of the new night guard has remained a mystery to me. But I'm afraid that the ancient Siberian warrior took revenge on him for his disturbed peace.